Hi, my name is Lee Smith. I've been a journalist for over 30 years. I lived in the Middle East for years and have covered foreign threats to the United States for decades. And for my entire life, Americans have mostly been united against the threats that have faced our great nation, including our elites in politics, media, business, academia, and culture. But today there is a new threat to our way of life, our security, and our stability: Chinese authoritarianism. The emergence of a hostile world power under the leadership of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. Now, America has overcome powerful adversaries many times before. But today is different. America's ruling class is no longer on the side of Americans. Rather, they're compromised by their dependence on China's rise. And so it's our elites and not China that represent the greatest threat to our national security. And so for the first time in our nation's history, the success of America's elite class weakens America. This is the story of how America's ruling classes attach themselves to a foreign power, China, in order to enrich themselves at the expense of the United States. This is the enemy within.
Released accidentally. Dr. Fauci, do you still support NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute.
From early on in the pandemic, we were told that COVID started in a wet market in Wuhan, China, and that it jumped from a bat to a pangolin to a human. It was so unforeseeable that it was hard to punish anyone or hold anyone accountable for what happened. Even Dr. Anthony Fauci, the public face of the US government's response to COVID, told us that it came from Wuhan's wet market.
It boggles my mind how when we have so many diseases that emanate out of that unusual human-animal interface, that we don't just shut it down. I don't know what else has to happen.
People started to point out the absurdity of that theory, that hundreds of thousands of people had become sick from a bad bowl of bat soup.
Number one, there is no animal host for COVID-19. We have not found, of the thousands of animals we tested in the wet market, none of them had COVID-19. When you take COVID-19...
And when some scientists, journalists, and political leaders started to point out that there was actually a laboratory in Wuhan, a city of 11 million people, that studied bat coronaviruses, they were accused of being conspiracy theorists. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, was among those at the very top of the list on television 2, sometimes 3 times a day, dismissing the lab leak theory as preposterous. Why many even accuse him of directly lying to the Senate in his May 2021 testimony, denying that his agency funded dangerous gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab. Anyone who challenged the standard narrative was ridiculed and mocked. Anyone who noted that there was a lab in the middle of Wuhan that did this research into bat coronaviruses was smeared as a conspiracy theorist. That includes, of course, then President of the United States, Donald Trump. Senior Republican officials like Senators Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz were all ridiculed by different press outlets. American journalists mocked anyone who said we should investigate the Wuhan lab. And instead they blamed the Trump administration for its response to COVID. The question is, why? Why have America's elites mocked what was always the most likely explanation for the origins of COVID-19? Why did they, Fauci foremost among them, push the Chinese government's propaganda? that COVID-19 came from a wet market. And that should raise another set of questions. For instance, why was the Wuhan lab performing dangerous research on bat coronaviruses in the first place? And why was Fauci's organization funding it? And why now are America's elites continuing to cover for the Chinese Communist Party? Well, as it turns out, they're not just covering for Beijing, they're also covering for themselves. How in the world did this come to be, where our elites are more invested in the power of China than in the progress of America? The American relationship with China, the American interpretation of China, goes back more than 100 years. China fell to the communists in 1949. U.S.-China relations were reopened in 1972 with Richard M. Nixon's trip to China in February 1972, the first American president to visit China since it became communist. So that was really the opening, a very important moment in American history, and it was Cold War history too, because both Nixon and Kissinger perceived that opening up to communist China would give the United States an advantage. It would be in the U.S. interest to try to divide the much more formidable, at the time, much more formidable communist power, the Soviet Union and China. And as it turns out, there was some success. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and in 1991, the Soviet Union was finished. But 1989 was also an important year in China, and an important year for American policy regarding China, because it was in 1989 that future Chinese President Jiang Zemin saw the student protesters going out into the streets at Tiananmen Square. This was the famous Tiananmen Square massacre. American policymakers were watching the whole time. And if they're looking at the Soviet Union, which fell in '89, and Tiananmen Square, also in '89, there's a very obvious difference. The Chinese fired on their own people. In effect, the Chinese were sending a message to American policymakers. You will not do to us what you did to the Russians. You will not shape us the way you think you want to shape us. You will deal with China the way it is, not as you imagine China might be. And that clearly did make an impression on American policymakers. China had asserted its will. After Tiananmen, human rights in China became a major concern for U.S. officials, including the Democratic Party's 1992 candidate for president, Bill Clinton. And yet, pressured by elites in both parties, instead of pushing back, Bill Clinton gave the Chinese Communists its biggest foreign policy win since Nixon's 1972 opening. In 1994, Bill Clinton delinked human rights from trade with China.
Today, I would like to announce a series of important decisions regarding the United States policy toward China. I have decided that the United States should renew most favored nation trading status toward China. This decision, I believe, offers us the best opportunity to lay the basis for long-term sustainable progress in human rights and for the advancement of our other interests with China.
When people talk about the global economy, what they really mean is cheap labor and free trade. The globalist leaders in the West understood that communist China would be the centerpiece of a global economic system. Why? Because of a large, cheap pool of labor under the control of an authoritarian regime. And so in 1994, Bill Clinton's China policy decoupled human rights and trade. In 2000, Clinton granted China most favored nation status in trade. And this led to a key moment in U.S.-China relations, China's 2001 accession to the World Trade Organization. And so, what the West had been dreaming of for decades, this cheap pool of labor would be the centerpiece of this new order, finally became true. What it meant was that people were going to get rich. There was a place for the American establishment to build wealth and power without anyone looking over their shoulder. the US government was signaling that trade with China was more important than human rights in China. America's public health elites took notice as well. Not only was China known for its human rights abuses, China also held a shockingly cavalier attitude toward risky scientific and medical experimentation. Human rights reports abound about China's so-called biotourism industry, that they harvest organs from living subjects, in particular Falun Gong and the Uyghurs, that they kill people to take their organs. The Western political establishment is well aware of these reports.
For over a decade, the People's Republic of China has stood publicly accused of acts of cruelty and wickedness that match the cruelty and wickedness of medieval torturers and executioners. If the accusations are true, thousands of innocents have been killed to order, having the physical integrity of their beings, their bodies, cut open while still alive, for their kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs, cornea, and skin to be removed and turned into commodities for sale. Doctors killed those innocent people simply because they pursued truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance in the case of Falun Gong practitioners, and lived lives of healthy exercise and meditation that was seen as dangerous to the interests and objectives of the totalitarian state of the People's Republic of China.
China was the perfect place to conduct what's known as gain-of-function research, precisely because it's considered risky. What gain-of-function research does is it genetically enhances biological organisms. And in the case of viruses, it makes them more dangerous. It can make them more transmissible or more deadly. The common rationale given for gain-of-function research is that it helps scientists anticipate what deadly viruses might evolve in nature and how they might pose a risk to humans. And so you can see why anyone concerned with public safety and national security would be very careful about funding such research, especially in a country with such lax safety controls. In 2014, the Obama administration imposed a moratorium on gain-of-function research after multiple accidents at US labs. The Center for Disease Control's lab in Atlanta had 2 different incidents, one with anthrax and another with influenza. At an NIH lab, researchers mishandled live samples of smallpox from 1954.
One approach is to engineer into the virus genetically based traits that mimic those that might occur in nature. These so-called gain-of-function experiments are not without risks, however, and have generated much discussion over biosafety and biosecurity issues. I think we all remember about a year ago reading the New York Times article that talked about the doomsday virus. I think that launched us off onto a very vibrant discussion about this type of research. These safety and security concerns are global in scope, and thus any path forward for this type of research must be developed through an international dialogue.
After the 2014 moratorium on gain-of-function went into effect, the controversial research funded by US taxpayer dollars kept on going, but in China. In 2014, Fauci's agency awarded a grant to a company called EcoHealth Alliance to, quote, understand the risk of bat coronavirus emergence. The project was given a 5-year renewal in 2019 and was canceled only in April 2020 after the Trump administration sounded the alarm over the Wuhan lab's potential role in causing COVID-19. Over a period of 6 years, EcoHealth Alliance was given $3.7 million in funding, with nearly $600,000 of that directly funneled into the lab in China. Of course, this was perhaps the country that was most apt to use bioweapons against the United States. And in fact, at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, according to State Department findings, there was a dual-use program at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. What we mean by dual use is it has both a civilian and a military component. In this case, military meaning bioweapons. Intelligence sources say it was obvious that there were Chinese military officers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Some sources say that people wearing military insignia on their lab coats could clearly be seen entering and leaving the Wuhan lab. And that's why this site has raised concerns of diplomats and intelligence officials for years. In 2015, the State Department received a warning from French intelligence that the Chinese were going to kick French scientists out of the lab. The French had basically built the Wuhan Institute of Virology's lab and trained the scientists with the understanding that they would continue to monitor and supervise the lab. So when the Chinese kicked the French out, that should have raised a red flag for Fauci and our public health leadership. And earlier in 2009, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton asked the French how they were going to make sure that Chinese and other foreign officials who visited weren't going to leak dangerous biowarfare information. And then in 2018, the State Department cabled back from China to the Trump administration, explaining that there were problems with Wuhan lab safety issues. It also alerted Trump administration officials that the lab's work on coronaviruses and their potential human transmission might cause a pandemic. And we now have a paper trail tying Fauci to the research being done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, effectively an arm of the Chinese government and the Chinese military. We spent US taxpayer money that may have cost and still be costing hundreds of thousands of American lives. Why won't Fauci answer direct questions? And why won't the media, or more than a handful of Republican officials, hold Fauci or the Chinese government responsible for the worst pandemic in over a century? Because powerful people in our country would stand to lose much if the financial relationship between the United States and China were put under a spotlight.
The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute
Do they fund
of Virology.
Dr. Barrick?
We do not fund.
Do you fund Dr. Barrick's gain-of-function research?
Dr. Barrett does not doing gain-of-function research, and if it is, it's according to the guidelines, and it is being conducted in North Carolina.
You don't think
in
inserting
China.
a bat virus spike protein that he got from the Wuhan Institute into the SARS virus is gain of function?
That is
You would
not-
be in the minority because at least 200 scientists have signed a statement from the Cambridge Working Group saying that it is gain of function.
Well, it is not. And if you look at the grant and you look at the progress reports, it is not gain of function, despite the fact that people tweet that.
So
they
do
write
you still
about it.
support sending money to the Wuhan Virology Institute?
We do not send money now to the Wuhan
Do you
Virology.
support sending money? We did.
Since then, Senator Paul has referred Dr. Fauci to the Department of Justice for a criminal investigation for lying to the Senate, which is a felony offense. Perhaps in the most shocking turn of events, an October 2021 letter from the National Institute of Health directly contradicts Fauci's statements to Congress, acknowledging that some of the funding to EcoHealth Alliance had indeed been used for gain-of-function research.
On your last trip to our committee on May 11th, you stated that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And yet, gain-of-function research was done entirely in the Wuhan Institute by Dr. Shi and was funded by the NIH. Dr. Richard E. Bright, a molecular biologist from Rutgers, described this research in Wuhan as the Wuhan lab used NIH funding to construct novel chimeric SARS-related coronaviruses able to infect human cells and laboratory animals. This is high-risk research that creates new potential pandemic pathogens potential pandemic pathogens that exist only in the lab, not in nature. This research matches, these are Dr. Ebright's words, this research matches, indeed epitomizes, the definition of gain-of-function research.
Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly, and I want to say that officially.
This is your definition that you guys wrote. It says that scientific research that increases the transmissibility among animals is gain-of-function. They took animal viruses that only occur in animals and they increased their transmissibility to humans. How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
It's a dance, and you're dancing around this because you're trying to obscure responsibility for 4 million people dying around the world from a pandemic.
It's Anthony Fauci and other American scientists who are standing in between the truth and the American people. They're protecting their relationships with Chinese Communist Party elites, from whom they draw so much of their wealth, power, and prestige. And as we shall see, at the head of the pro-China faction of the American establishment is none other than President Joe Biden.